While I've been reading Foucault's writings on power, something occurred to me about the typical approach to power analysis. There are some theories that are proposed simply because they sound good, but are not actually true. The idea that power over individuals enables the total state, arrived at by Foucault, caused me to rethink something that I've heard liberals say, something which most people just take for granted as true. If you've paid any attention to what we might call radical centrists or the intellectual dark web types, they have certain arguments that suppose that totalitarianism is enabled by collectivism or collectivization. It sounds like a true theory, but if you actually interrogate it, it becomes pretty clear that it's a very intellectually lazy argument. The centrists see that collectivist societies like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany were totalitarian, and because totalitarianism and collectivism showed up in the same societies, they simply conclude that collectivism caused totalitarianism. Now, if I were to steelman the argument, I would basically say that collectivism might cause totalitarianism because it tends to lead to the instrumentalization of individuals, meaning that people essentially become sacrifices to the collective, and so any possible restrictions upon their autonomy become justified therefore. However, one must note that in order to instrumentalize someone, it's first necessary to turn them into an individual and to individualize power such that it can be exerted upon these new subjects that have been created. So collectivism ironically requires a high degree of individualization to pull off, and as I will argue later, this individualization is precisely what individualism already accomplishes anyway. And of course, I must also point out that there are different kinds of collectivism. I have a version of collectivism that I call true collectivism, as distinguished from vulgar collectivism. Vulgar collectivism being the idea that all people within a collective are sort of parts of a unit. Instead, I think that the personality of people should be respected within a collective, and so individuals should not be, let's say, trounced upon for the sake of the collective. But instead, the well-being of every single person inside the collective should be considered when we consider the well-being of the collective as a whole. So in that way, people are not whatsoever instrumentalized. When we look even deeper, we see that the actual argument these people are making is that individualism is a bulwark against totalitarianism. But is this actually true? What about individualism makes it difficult to create a totalitarian society? We must first start by defining individualism. Individualism is the belief that the fundamental organizing principle of the state ought to be the welfare of the individual. We could say that individualism is precisely the guarantee of rights for the individual, but the term rights is very heterogeneous. A right can trouble autonomy just as it secures it, so I don't believe that a sufficient definition of individualism would be rights that secure individual autonomy. We can see in today's so-called liberal countries that individual autonomy no longer counts for much, despite the foundation of these orders on guarantees of individual rights. A right is simply the application of government force for some purpose, a guarantee that something will be enforced by law and thus also by violence. We can see how, in civil rights law, the rationale of individual rights has been used to restrict speech in liberal nations such as the UK or Australia. And of course, in the United States, there are troubling attempts to codify anti-Semitism into law, as well as to define hate crimes. What all of these rights have in common, however, is an attempt to secure the well-being of individuals in the population, the well-being of individual minorities, the well-being of criminals, the well-being of deviants, and so on. What the ideal of individualism is, in practical terms, is precisely this almost pastoral management of every single person in society, regardless of category. Now, I know some people are going to protest against my definition of individualism because a lot of individualists, self-described individualists, would say that their version of individualism is a guarantee of rights of individual autonomy and freedom. But if we look back to what some of the founding fathers have said about the United States, they have essentially said that the purpose of individual rights is to guarantee prosperity and happiness. So I don't think unlimited autonomy is precisely what the founding fathers had in mind, especially when we consider that at no point did they ever say we couldn't have restrictive laws or we couldn't impose laws that affect individuals. And in fact, if you look at the way the founding fathers actually administer the state, well, George Washington went to go put down rebellions. He didn't let their individual autonomy predominate, he came in with the state and smashed the rebellions. So clearly this isn't an issue of individual autonomy, but rather an issue of the individual prosperity of all people within the nation. This brings me to my central counter-argument against the notion that individualism secures us against totalitarianism. In every totalitarian state, from George Orwell's Airstrip 1 to the actual Soviet Union, we see something rather peculiar that I've talked about in my previous few videos. Instead of collectivizing power and exercising power in groups, we actually see that power becomes individualized. It should be obvious then at this point that a totalitarian society can be built on the basis of an individualist pastoral power. The logic might follow as, we must prevent people from doing what is harmful to themselves and to society. We must ensure that people are as healthy and productive as possible. We must ensure that every person be prohibited from doing that which makes their living impossible. Now, from a certain point of view, we might even be able to say that societies of the past were collectivist in a sense. They were based on caste or status, and each caste was something of a collective group that the state dealt with in a different way, ascribing them different rights, duties, and privileges. We might think of the Estates General from the Ancien regime. The individualism of liberal societies is a repudiation of this gathering together of people into collective groups. Now, despite this fact that those traditional societies were in a sense collectivist, feudal societies and monarchical societies were never able to develop a system of totalitarianism. They simply lacked the power necessary to accomplish that. And it's not like they were without theory, for example, Plato's Republic, and various kinds of political utopias that manifested in writing in the 1600s. The totalitarian collectivist societies that came later, which almost like traditional societies, not to equivocate them of course, organized humans into groups with collective rights and duties, were different in one way. They were able to harness state power against the individual. The kind of totalitarianism that we see in the Soviet Union is impossible without some sort of system of surveillance, whether it is human or technological. And once again, what distinguishes modern surveillance from government in the past is that it has the power to give the state information about individuals, not just broad groups of people. The state then knows which individuals are subversive or seditious, which individuals are recalcitrant, which individuals are violating laws, how much property each individual owns, and how much each individual is connected to every other individual. Then it becomes possible to actually punish these people on an individual basis, which when brought to the scale of society as a whole, enables the regulation of every single person in the state. Liberals think that they have managed to thwart the political techniques employed in totalitarian states, but they have not. The consequence of individualizing politics is that it also individualizes power. We see in the Western world, especially in the United States, that there's a tremendous amount of domestic spying, surveillance, and data gathering. The NSA collects data on every single phone call, every single internet search, and every single message you send on social media. Western countries regularly send this information to each other and also mutually spy on each other to complete the surveillance network. The complex technology of surveillance that has been established is of course seldom actually employed as far as we know, but this could change overnight. We already see surveillance used against nationalist groups regularly, and also recently we've seen Donald Trump say he's going to use AI surveillance to target pro-Palestinian protesters. This notion that the fundamental unit of society is the individual has been the rationale behind the worst abuses of political power inside of our nations. What essentially happens under individualism is that every single individual is made into a subject. They are objectivized, turned into objects of power, and then every possible action that could be taken is unleashed upon them. We can already see the emergence of this possibility in the French Letters de Cachet, where individuals would be reported to the crown and the demands would be made to punish that individual. Only now there's no need for a bottom-up approach in which the individual's acquaintances or family members complain about them. Surveillance fills in the gap, and the scale balloons tremendously. Of course, this isn't to say that transitioning to a collectivist society would solve the problem. Rather, the point is to understand that political individualism cannot stop these flagrant exercises of power. This demolishes a crucial piece of the argument that liberals have against, say, a racial collectivist society. They would normally prognosticate that racial collectivism would just turn into totalitarianism, and so even if it has benefits, it would be worse than the freedom guaranteed by individualism. But since this dichotomy breaks down, individualist societies being just as potentially prone to totalitarianism as collectivist ones, there remains no serious reason to reject racial collectivism. In my previous videos, I have already gone over what is necessary to actually prevent totalitarianism. It has nothing to do with demolishing collectivism. Rather, it is an issue of sovereignty, pastoral power, and political rationality. In addition, the presence of a master class upon which the sovereign is reliant to rule, such as vassals or lords, creates a natural check and balance upon the degree to which he can exercise his authority. As Foucault states, power is a series of relationships. No one idea or ideology can explain why the total state comes into existence. It's instead through a complex interaction of various elements and actors that states acquire the power to rule. A state must have legitimacy so that it can maintain its power of command or the possibility of the ruled being obeyed. A state must have information so that it can locate objects of power and control subject populations. A state must have force so it can impose its will upon the actions of others. All this is reliant upon a complicated web of institutions and people, and I believe that the more isolated people are in this network, the more possible it is for power to exercise its will upon them without resistance. This is what individualism does. It depotentizes the individual by stripping him of community. Now isolated, he is powerless to resist the dictates of the state. Without the network of collective resistance that ordinarily would exist in a traditional society of organic bonds, the sovereign is free to do whatever he wishes. All it takes is for the pretense of separated powers to collapse, either through competition-based merging or through the declaration of emergency power, then liberalism becomes totalitarianism. Of course, the reality is more complicated than that, as I've alluded to. No such isolation existed in Russia, though in the Weimar Republic, one can make the argument that Weimar liberalism had an isolating effect, especially in the midst of political conflict. But the point is that individualism just isn't the shield against totalitarianism that liberals think it is. It already completes part of the puzzle.